I think I recognize some faces in here. Has anybody seen any of my presentations before? Just okay, 2, 3 guys, good. So I'll just do a quick introduction. My name, as Rick pointed out, is Kevin Morris. I'm with the Federal Aviation Administration. I've been with them for just over 10 years now, doing a variety of things. But for one of my jobs for the last 4 or 5 years has been to be a UAS point of contact, a kind of a drone specialist for the Minneapolis District Office. My primary job is I manage the safety program for the FAA, and that includes a lot of education and outreach. And so I'm kind of combining those two specialties, and I'm doing a lot of UAS presentations and seminars right now because this is a pretty hot topic. It's the fastest growing segment of aviation. When we were doing all the registrations, we had twice as many UAS or twice as many drones registered as manned aircraft. So this is something it's trending extremely high and growing very quickly. And what everybody's doing with it is media. Certainly there is a public safety, there's search and rescue aspects of it, firefighting, things of that nature, but the primary growth is media. So that's photography and video. And so what I want to do today is just do a short presentation, maybe 25 minutes long, to give you guys sort of the framework of how this works for you folks in the media industry, what you need to do, what the requirements and regulations are so that you guys can go out there and either film for the business, film on your own, but nonetheless operate drones commercially in the media industry. The rest of the time, we have about an hour, I'd like to just open up to questions. I don't like to stand up here and try to guess at what I think your guys' questions are going to be and then put it in my PowerPoint. So I'm going to go over sort of the framework, and then I'd like you guys to ask me questions. Please don't leave here without having a question answered, because I will stick around as long as it takes to answer questions. We're being videotaped and filmed here, so I will probably repeat your question when you ask it so that it's picked up on the microphone for this video production later. So with that, we're going to move on here and talk primarily about media operations. And what I want to do today is cover some basic myths and facts, go over what the heck an unmanned aircraft system is, how the FAA views it, and then talk about the remote pilot certificate, a little bit about Part 107, which are the operational rules for commercial UAS, and then again at the end we'll go over and I'll answer any questions and take as much time as we need to get you guys' information to you. So some myths here. This is probably the number one myth I see across all spectrums in the US when it comes to commercial operations. People assume that because nobody's cutting me a paycheck or I'm not accepting payment for something, I'm not a commercial operator. I don't have to comply with Part 107 rules. I don't have to register my UAS because nobody's paying me. I'm just doing this on my own and I'm just giving the video away. I'm not charging any money. The reality is, anytime you're operating a UAS, unmanned aircraft system, or drone as we like to call them, and you're not doing it for purely personal recreational uses, it's going to be considered a civil or commercial UAS operation. So let me try to give you a scenario that I like to use because I think it paints the picture pretty well. Say you're a farmer and you own some land and you buy a UAS, and you bought one because it's neat. You want to go out and take some video of your land. You want to put the video up on YouTube or your Facebook page, maybe take a couple pictures and hang it on your wall because it's just a neat tool, it's a toy, and you're going out and it's fun. More than likely that's a recreational use. You're not going to be subject to all these things that we're going to be talking about here in the next 20 minutes. Same farmer, same land, same UAS decides to go out and film his crops. And he's going to show, hey, there's an infested area here, or this particular area of the field is dry. I need to apply this product over here to stop this infestation of whatever, or I've got weeds growing over here. Nobody paid him to do it. He's not cutting himself a check. It's the same UAS, the same land. It could be even the same flight path. But now he's using that to further his business. He's using the UAS as a tool to further his business of agriculture, farming. That would be considered commercial. So when we get into the difference between hobby and commercial, in a lot of ways it boils down to flight by flight and almost the semantics or the purpose of that flight. If the purpose of the flight is going to be recreational, it's recreational. But if you take off with any other intent other than recreational or personal enjoyment, it's going to be considered civil operations, which we often use interchangeably with commercial operations here in the U.S. So realtors, nonprofits, you folks out here doing media production, advertising, that's all going to be considered commercial operations. So a lot of people think, well, as long as I do it hobby, I don't have to follow any rules whatsoever. The reality is there's quite a few rules out there for hobbyists. They don't get a free-for-all. It's not that they have all sorts of permissions and abilities that you guys don't have because you're operating under the constraints of Part 107 of the regulations. There are certainly some things like careless and reckless operation. We have operating rules and safety of the National Airspace System, that's the NAS. So hobbyists aren't exempt from everything that you guys have to work with. They're just operating under a different set of circumstances, but they still have to operate without careless or reckless action. The other one is FAA doesn't control airspace below a certain altitude. I've heard 73 feet or 83 feet or 200. I've heard various altitudes all over the place. And yes, we do. The FAA is in charge of controlling airspace, regulating airspace down to the surface. So that means if it comes off the ground and the vehicle can navigate, it's an FAA airspace. So you don't have airspace rights above your house like a lot of people think. Well, my airspace property rights go up to 100 feet above my house. Nobody can penetrate that airspace above my property. That's not true. That's not true. The FAA owns that airspace. Privacy, which is a whole other topic, could be an issue with that. But the airspace rights itself, the ability to control or access or deny access to that airspace resides with the FAA or our Air Traffic Control Division. So let's still talk about UAS. The one thing we want to be very clear on is that we see drones, quadcopters, remote-controlled airplanes, unmanned aircraft systems are aircraft. That's how the FAA has always viewed it. It was actually challenged all the way up to the NTSB, and the NTSB agreed with the FAA. That was an FAA versus Perker case that made it all the way up to the NTSB court. And the NTSB agreed that yes, these things, drones or UAS quadcopters, are aircraft. So in order to have a solid understanding and to make sense of what's going to happen here for the next few minutes, we have to believe this. You have to understand this and you have to accept this, that UAS are aircraft. We treat them as aircraft. We register them as aircraft. The state of Minnesota treats them as aircraft and registers as an aircraft. Part 107 is the rule that we're going to be operating under. That was established back in 2016. It's really not a big rule. If you compare it to some of the other rules in the FAA, Part 107 isn't a monster. But it can be very confusing if Part 107 is your very first introduction to the Federal Aviation Regulations. How we write them, how you read them, and how you operate by them. But what Part 107 does is it provides use of commercial drones in the National Airspace System. The other thing it does is certifies remote pilots. So we have a pilot certificate now that is designed specifically for remote pilots. Anybody have one of those near? Great. So you guys have been through that process. You know what it takes. We recognize three types of operators. Hobby, which we talked a little bit about, civil, and public. For our discussion here today, we're not going to talk about hobby use because I don't think anybody here is excited to do hobby operations. We're talking about civil commercial operations. Many of you remember the middle thing, that was a Lake-made beer. I don't know that they could get a UAS to carry a full 12-pack glass bottles of beer, but it certainly made for good marketing. That would be a civil commercial use. The other is public, and we'll touch a little bit on that. Civil operations, where we're going to operate for media production, is under Part 107. Part 107 is our civil operation rules for UAS. You can call it commercial. The technical name is civil operations. So we consider anybody operating outside of hobbyists or public aircraft to be a civil operator. Meaning that if you take off and your intent is to do anything other than what the hobby rules or recreational rules allow you to do, you're going to be considered a civil operator subject to all the rules and regulations. And that's the big key. People think, well, if I follow 3 out of the 4 rules for hobbyists, I'm okay. The reality is, if you don't go 4 for 4 on the hobbyist rules, or 5 for 5, I forget exactly how many there are, they're not very many, but if you don't follow all of them, we consider you operating under Part 107, civil/commercial use. Public use is pretty limited, and for the most part, media outlets aren't operating under public use. When we're talking public use, we've got the alphabet soup groups out there, mainly state and local agencies. Some universities have authorization to operate as public use. I think the University of Minnesota has 2 or 3, if I recall, public use authorizations. They do some research and development in some of their areas. But we authorize this through a certificate of authorization. So that's different than Part 107. Part 107 authorizes you through a remote pilot certificate. Public use authorizes you through the certificate of authorization. This isn't something that you can just decide to do, public use. So if you're thinking about going on the public use route, I would ask that you do some serious research on it, because you can't just decide one day, well, I'm going to operate public use. There's a lot of paperwork on the front end of public use before you start flying under that operational set of rules. So we're going to stay focused on the Part 107, the commercial side, because that's, again, where most of you are going to operate. When you're operating a UAS under Part 107, you are going to be required to register it with the FAA. We also required hobbyists to register with the FAA, but that was recently overturned, so now hobbyists do not need to register the UAS with the FAA. It was a rule something like between 0.55 pounds and 55 pounds they had to register it, but that got overturned in a DC court, so hobbyists at this time do not need to register. We encourage them to register, but they're not required to. You guys operating under Part 107, regardless of the weight of the UAS, must register. And I'll give you a tip here. This is a screenshot of our website. I think it's just register my UAS at .faa.gov. It costs $5 to register a UAS, and it's $5 per UAS. There are companies out there that will be more than happy to charge you a lot of money to register a UAS. We'll save you the paperwork, we'll save you all the trouble, we're really good at it. For 50 bucks, we'll make sure your UAS gets registered. And you can pay them 50 bucks, and then they'll make 45 off of it, because it takes $5 in about 5 minutes to do it. It's really not complicated. So do a little bit of research, use our website. It's the one they're going to use when they charge you as well. So who needs to register? Again, anybody operating UAS commercially. So anybody operating under Part 107 has to register their UAS. If you're operating outdoors, that's key. If you're operating in a covered facility where the UAS doesn't have a chance to escape laterally or vertically into the NAS, the National Airspace System, there are no rules that apply to you. There are no Part 107 rules that apply indoors. If we're flying a UAS in this room and you were doing it commercially and somebody was paying you to do it, you don't have to have a remote pilot certificate. You don't have to follow the rules, because you're indoors. The minute we go outdoors, all of this applies. So the FAA does not control airspace indoors. Now, stadiums with retractable roof or semi-covered stadiums, I'll leave that up to the attorneys. That's not where I go. In order to register, you have to be at least 13 years old and a permanent resident or U.S. citizen. And you register, there's a web address, registermyuas.faa.gov, if it weighs less than 55 pounds. If you're flying a large UAS or some sort of specialty device, we have to go through a paper method. But most UAS right now are underneath that 55 pounds. And that 55 pounds includes the equipment you're hanging off of it. So if it's a 45-pound vehicle and you're hanging 15 pounds worth of equipment off there, that's not going to be 55 pounds. And you most likely will not be able to operate under Part 107, because that deals with small UAS anyway. So that's a whole different world. So if you're looking at operating a large UAS that's going to weigh more than 55 pounds, there's a whole set of different circumstances you need to consider, different paperwork, different process. Right now we're talking about small UAS, so those that are under 55 pounds and under. What you get is this, a certificate of registration. You're going to get one per UAS, and it's $5, and it's every 3 years. They have to renew that. So if you have 10 UAS at your media company, it's going to be $50 every 3 years to renew your UAS registrations. But you're going to get one card for each. It'll list the make and model and serial number on that card, and you need to have that card with you when you're operating. So two pieces of identification you should always carry with you, other than your state-issued ID, driver's license, whatever, would be your remote pilot certificate and your registration card for your UAS. In the rare chance you would ever be approached by an FAA inspector and kind of what we call ramp checked for your UAS operation. You need to mark your UAS with your registration number from the FAA. It has to be done in a permanent way, a permanent marker or a label that's going to stay on it. You can engrave it. The key is that we have to be able to see the number. Or if you're going to put the number inside of a compartment, we have to be able to have access to that compartment without any special tools to get in there. So thumb screw or something of that nature. We made that rule because certain people didn't want big ugly numbers on their side of their RC controlled aircraft back when we had hobbyists flying these and registering them, and they wanted to keep it sort of pristine and original, so we allowed that. But most people operating commercial UAS have the number right on the side of the UAS itself. Now, I'd be remiss standing in the MnDOT Department of Aeronautics if I didn't mention that they have requirements as well. So I'm standing here as a representative of the Federal Aviation Administration telling you, you need to register with us. You have to pay your money to register with us. The state of Minnesota also requires registration with them. And they're also going to require, and Rick, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you're going to need a commercial operating license with the state of Minnesota. And that's going to require that you carry insurance. We at the FAA do not require you to carry insurance. There's no rule that says you have to have insurance on your UAS. But in order to operate in the state of Minnesota, they're going to require that. So insurance is required through the state of Minnesota. And Rick, did I miss anything?
I'd just say that our definition of commercial operator is a little different than the FAA's definition of commercial operator. The insurance requirement goes with the registration of the aircraft. And if you are selling your services to others, that's when you get to be a commercial operator in the state side.
Okay, so it's a little bit different on the definition side, but still kind of on the same channel. When you do this, make sure you check with the state that you're operating in to ensure that they don't have requirements for you as a unmanned aircraft system operator that you weren't aware of. You don't want to run afoul of any state regulations because they have really great ways of tracking you guys down, almost better than what we have. So remote pilot certificate, about half of you guys had this in the room. In order to get it, we require you pass a knowledge test. The knowledge test is going to cover a variety of topics in the FAA for what we think remote pilots need to know. Airspace rules, air traffic procedures, weather requirements, crew resource management, radio comms, things like that. I would recommend that before you go in and take this knowledge exam, which there's probably half a dozen companies around most metro areas that will administer the test. It's technically a computer test, but for some reason I still call it a written exam. But the computer test, before you go in and take it, do some studying. Don't walk in there and thinking that, well, they're just going to ask me a bunch of questions on drones. I know everything about drones because I've been using drones for 10 years. Nothing's new to me. You probably won't be happy with the outcome. Most of the time, these companies are charging, I've heard, roughly around $150 to take that knowledge exam for your remote pilot certificate. You don't want to have a failure because nobody likes failing at anything, and you don't want to be out $150. So do some studies. I can't recommend a specific course of study or a company. There's a lot out there. I would say do your research. Find a company that's going to do a knowledge test prep for the price you want to pay and has a good reputation. I don't think they're too difficult to find, but do your studying before you go in and take this test. Otherwise, it won't be a pleasant experience for you. Once you do get completed with the test, you submit that information online through our Airman application system, and we will issue a UAS pilot certificate, and it's going to have a small unmanned aircraft system rating on the back. And I like the way we did it because if you ask me, that leaves room for large unmanned aircraft system ratings down the road. So we didn't make this a small unmanned aircraft system pilot certificate. We made it a remote pilot certificate. And you get a small unmanned aircraft system rating. So to me, this is good for the industry because it allows us to manage your ratings on the back of the certificate as this industry grows and as we try to keep pace with it. So that's a pretty good deal. Once you get the certificate, you're not done forever. It's not a one and done thing. Every 2 years, you're going to need to renew your certificate. Your certificate itself doesn't expire. There's no expiration date on it, but your ability to exercise its privileges will expire. You're going to need to show every 24 calendar months, which is FAA speak for 2 years, every 2 years that you complete a recurrent training program. What that looks like right now, not really sure. Since we only started issuing these back in August of 2016, nobody's due for their 2-year recurrent training yet. I would hope that we are working diligently on this so that by August of 2018, we have it all set to go. Quite frankly, it'd be nice by the summer everybody knew what was coming so we could get prepared, but we'll see how that goes. But nonetheless, every 2 years you're going to have to renew that certificate in terms of your currency. You're not going to get a new card in the mail. You're not going to have to go through and apply. It's just simply you'll be issued more than likely be issued a certificate that says I completed my recurrent training on this date, and you're going to keep that certificate with you and carry it around to show if anybody asks, I'm current, here's when I took my recurrent training. Manned aircraft pilots do the same thing. It's called a flight review. There's usually an endorsement that somebody signs in a logbook that they show the same type of thing. Now, I do want to touch a little bit on Part 107. This won't be a comprehensive review of the rule because I don't want to put you guys all to sleep so early in the morning. I want to focus on Subpart B, which is operating rules. And some of the big ones here that I want to make sure that we kind of drive home, because a lot of people think, well, once I get a remote pilot certificate, I can do all this wonderful thing. Well, yes and no. So there are some constraints for you for operating on Part 107. The first one here is that we require whoever is manipulating the flight controls, or if somebody's under your direct supervision, the remote pilot in command, the person in charge of that UAS flight, must have a current remote pilot certificate. The rule does allow for someone else to fly the UAS without a remote pilot certificate, as long as you are there next to them, have the ability to take the controls instantly to stop whatever may be happening that's not okay. But even if this person's flying without a remote pilot certificate, and I've got the remote pilot certificate, and they do something against regulation with it, I'm still the remote pilot in command. I'm the one that's going to get talked to by the FAA or have to go through an investigation or enforcement process. The remote pilot in command is where the buck stops, to use kind of an old saying. So even if you're not flying, if you're operating under this section here, you're directly supervising somebody. If they do something wrong or crash it, or it goes into a schoolyard full of kids, it's the remote pilot in command who's going to be held responsible. So keep that in mind. The other thing we require is we limit you to daylight operations. By rule, you're limited to flying daylight only, which gives you the authorization to operate 30 minutes before sunrise, we call that twilight, civil twilight, all the way to 30 minutes past sunset. Those are your normal operating hours. So operating at night, as it's written in the rule, is prohibited. Now I'm going to talk about waivers here in just a minute, but I'm going to go through a few of these slides to get there. We also require that you are able to see the UAS at all times. Visual line of sight. You cannot take off your UAS and go trucking down 4 miles down the road using first-person view and not see it and not know where it is. Somebody has to be in visual sight of that UAS at all times, whether that's you or you're using a visual observer to help you. The UAS has to be within your visual line of sight. You may not fly over people. Now that's open for a lot of debate. What the heck is over people? But the rule itself says you may not operate over a human being unless that human being is directly participating in the operation. And what we mean by that is people that are there specifically for the operation of the UAS. And for most UAS operations, that's going to be a remote pilot, a visual observer, and maybe one other person monitoring data or feed. Maybe 3 people, perhaps 4 at most. It does not include the on-air talent. It doesn't include people being interviewed. It's only the people that are directly responsible for the operation of that UAS. So this comes up a lot of times when people do filming of commercials. Well, all the actors, they're all part of this thing. They're not directly involved with operating that UAS. You may not operate directly over them by rule. The other time you can operate over them if they are in a covered structure or a stationary vehicle. Stationary vehicle is important because no, you cannot take this up over a highway and say, well, everybody's in a covered vehicle or a covered structure, they're fine. No, those cars are doing 50, 70, 80 miles an hour. They're moving. You can't be flying over them. So that's how the rule is written for this. Now, directly over a human being, I get asked this a lot. What does that really mean? The easy answer is if I look up and the UAS is directly over my head, I think everyone in this room would agree that's directly over somebody. Where it gets a little bit more interesting is if it's off to the side, but now we've got wind. So I'm not involved with the operator of the UAS. Say I'm the on-air talent, and I'm standing here, and the UAS is flying over there, but the wind is blowing this way. If that UAS were to lose all power, where would the wind push it? Directly into me. It would go right onto my head, let's say, worst case scenario. So the way I tell people to think about this is, when you're flying your UAS, don't fly it directly over people. Everybody pretty much understands what that means. But don't fly it where if you were to lose power, it's going to go right into those people. Same situation. The UAS is right there. I'm the on-air talent. The wind is blowing this way. Same position, but now the wind changed direction, right? So now it loses power. It's going to go away from me. I would not consider that directly over people. So I try not to use the word common sense because that can mean different things to different people. But it's a little bit of common sense. And the kind of litmus test I ask people to use is, if you're flying your UAS around people and it's going to lose power, where's it going to go? Let's say it's a catastrophic failure. I'm not talking about a flyaway or partial power loss or it drifts off and you can't get your, but I'm saying it's coming out of the sky and there's nothing you're going to do to stop it. Where is it going to land? And if your answer is in that crowd of people over there, I would probably argue that you're in violation of this rule. We also restrict operating in certain airspace. Class B, C, D, lateral boundaries of Class E to the surface. We restrict operating around airports. So you're not allowed to interfere with the traffic pattern or cause any delays at any airport. And when I say airport, I mean heliports, glider bases, seaplane bases. Anything that's taking in and out aircraft from the sky is considered an airport. So what does that mean? That means if you're looking at this right now on the screen and you have no idea what that is, you need to do some homework. This is what we call a sectional chart, or technically it's a terminal area chart for the Minneapolis area. But this is a three-dimensional map on a two-dimensional screen. And you need to understand that, because if you're going to comply with Part 107, talking about airspace, for example, this is Class Bravo, surface up to 10,000 feet. Over here is Class Delta. This is Flying Cloud in Eden Prairie. That goes from the surface up to 3,400 feet. You need to understand those lateral and vertical boundaries of airspace and the requirements to get in and out of them. The rule mandates it. You can't operate in certain airspace without receiving proper air traffic authorization. And I'll let you guys throw tomatoes at me all day long for our authorization process and how slow it is and it doesn't work. And I've heard it all, but I'll stand up here and take it. We do have altitude restrictions. 400 feet is your maximum altitude unless you're operating within a 400-foot radius of a structure. If you're operating within 400-foot radius of a structure, you can go up to the top of that structure plus 400 feet. So think of a big radio antenna, 2,000-foot tall radio tower out in western Minnesota. 400 feet doesn't get you to the top of the 2,000-foot tower. But if you're within a 400-foot radius of that tower, this rule permits you to go all the way up to the top of that tower plus 400 feet. So you can go all the way up to 2,400 feet. As a remote pilot, you need to be absolutely certain that when you go up to 2,400 feet, you're not poking into any airspace up there that you're not supposed to be in without ATC authorization. Again, that's why we have that written knowledge test. That's why we have you do the course of study, or recommend you do the course of study, because you need to know the airspace you're operating in at all times. We want you guys out there flying. We really do. Despite what you might have heard, we are embracing unmanned aircraft systems. We want you to do it safely. I want you guys to do it safely because I want you guys to be safe. But the other thing is that in order for this industry to grow, it has to be done safely. If we are operating unsafe or in contrary to rule, it's going to have a negative effect on rulemaking for you guys. It'll have a negative effect on public perception for you guys. And God forbid one of your UAS hits an airplane someday. Because I'll tell you what, the media, most of the media is waiting for that to happen, because that's a big news story. It's a big news story. And we're coming awfully close, far too close and far too frequently than we want to admit. But we got to be careful out there. We have to stay away from clouds. You got to be 500 feet below any cloud and at least 2,000 feet horizontally How you measure that with your eyeballs, I'm not quite certain, but certainly you can know where the base of the clouds are by checking aviation weather reports and then subtracting your altitude from that. You can't be above the cloud. Why? Well, you couldn't see it. You can't see the UAS if you're above the cloud, right? Visual line of sight. Now, this is my last slide before we get into some questions. Privacy comes up a lot. Local ordinances, questions come up a lot. We don't regulate privacy at the FAA. So an issue of whether or not you can hover your UAS over somebody's backyard and film through their windows or film their kids at the swimming pool is not an FAA concern. We don't have the jurisdiction over that. But local law enforcement does. So please understand what your local laws are for privacy, understand what they allow you to do and what they allow you not to do, and what the consequences are. Again, it gets back a little bit into public perception. I hear it all the time. If I see one hovering over my backyard, I'm shooting it down. My response is, please don't shoot down UAS. There's different ways we can handle that versus you getting out a shotgun and blowing it out of the sky. It's not good for anybody. But we need to know what our local laws are. Cities, townships cannot enact legislation or ordinances that trump federal law. So they cannot enact a law that says, in our city, we don't allow UAS to fly over anything within city limits. They can't do that because at that point they're regulating airspace. They cannot regulate airspace. Just like a homeowner doesn't own the airspace in his backyard, a city doesn't own the airspace above the city. They can regulate what you need to do to fly a UAS within city limits. They can say you have to register UAS or notify the city or something like that. They can create an ordinance like that. They can create an ordinance that says nobody may launch or recover a UAS from a city park. They can do that because they certainly control the surface. They can't stop you from flying over it, but they can say you can't launch or recover anywhere within city property because they own the ground. They can certainly do that. So there's a lot of this push and pull right now happening with cities, townships, on trying to get a grasp on it. And the big push is privacy. They're all very concerned with privacy. That's the driving force behind almost all the regulations or ordinances people send to me all the time. Hey, look what this city is doing. It's all having to deal with privacy. And again, that's not something we regulate, but we certainly do regulate the airspace, so they cannot make rules that stop you from operating the airspace when the FAA allows you to through Part 107. So that's a little bit about city ordinances. My recommendation is to check. Know what the local laws are. Know what the city ordinances are before you go out there. And if they seem wildly restrictive, open a dialogue with the city. Try to educate them, because you're going to find out most cities have no clue about drones or FAA or regulations. They're just doing what they think is best for their citizens. So try to educate them first before you go full speed ahead and say, I've got the right to do it, get out of my way. Education, cooperation always works best. So that's my contact information. Probably regret putting that up there at some point. But if you guys have questions, you can email me or give me a call. I kind of want to take the last 25, 30 minutes or so and just open up the floor to questions, because I want to make sure you guys get your questions answered before leaving. You can ask me about rumors. You can ask me about what you can and can't do. I'll try to give you the best answer I can. Again, I'll probably repeat your question because we're being mic'd and filmed. I did that good of a job, huh? I left no questions whatsoever. Yes, sir.
Go. Well, you go.
Oh, don't be afraid now.
How do you recommend tracking? Well, a couple questions. One would be also on the operators, commercial operators, permit or license. Do you know if all states require that?
I don't think that all states, in fact, I'm pretty sure Wisconsin does not require commercial operations license for a UAS operator. So I think that's specific to Minnesota.
Okay. My question for you is, how do you recommend tracking down city ordinances?
Okay, so, well, the first question you asked, just so we get picked up on the mic, was, do all states require commercial licensing and registration, something like that? And the answer came from Rick Bronig of MnDOT Aeronautics, that said he doesn't think all states do. In fact, Wisconsin, you pointed out, does not. Your second question is, how do you track down city ordinances? Are you asking in terms of kind of doing an investigation into like all the different ones, or I want to operate in Bemidji, what do I need to do? Call the city and ask them. And just say, hey, look, I'm coming up there, we're going to do some filming with a drone. Do you guys have any ordinances regarding UAS? You probably have to call it drone because they won't know what UAS means, but do you have any ordinances regarding drone operations within city limits? And they'll be able to tell you, because it's still a pretty hot button issue for most cities. They're either just letting the ink dry on the ordinance, or they're in the process of writing it, so it shouldn't be a foreign topic to them. But I would just call ahead.
Flying indoors. I've seen a video out there in North America where they're flying indoors, but over people, under people, up escalators, all over the place. Where does that fall?
Okay, so the question is flying indoors, for example, like the Mall of America, where they're obviously inside a structure and they're zipping around over, under people, up escalators. We don't regulate that. It's an ugly answer, but we don't have any regulations for that, operating indoors. I would imagine if they zipped up the escalator and plowed into somebody's little girl, there'll be a lawsuit. And the kiosk that was selling the drone or whatever will probably be out of business. I don't think they have deep pockets at the kiosk. But that's something that we just don't regulate indoor airspace. You know, it's considered, that airspace, unlike your backyard, for example, would be considered private property. Interestingly enough, one of the things they do out at Oshkosh every year at EA AirVenture, if you guys haven't been, they're really expanding it to try to meet a lot of the drone community's needs. They have a tent, is I think the technical term that they call it, but it's really just a mesh enclosure. And it's outside, and you look up and there's the sky, but it's encapsulated or encased in this mesh secure netting, I guess I would call it. And we don't regulate anything in there. They can do anything they want because that is not outdoor. There's no chance for that UAS to enter the NAS uncontrolled, much like if it was just a covered structure. So that's another way to do it. But yeah, when they're indoors, the FAA, we just don't regulate that. But good question though. Yes, sir.
Waivers. I've talked with at least one commercial operator who's gotten some permanent waivers to fly in certain areas. Is that very common in terms of, in the Minneapolis area where you're limited a lot by airspace? They, limited height, maybe openly 100 feet in some places, but is that an option to go down?
Yeah, so the question is for waivers, especially around the Minneapolis area where there's just a lot of airspace. People are getting some waivers that seem permanent or last a long time. There are two types of permissions, I guess would be the best way to describe that, the FAA will issue for UAS right now. One is a waiver. You would request a waiver if, for example, you wanted to operate outside of a rule like operating at night. Let's say I need to do some night filming. The rule only allows me to fly during the daytime. I want to operate at night. The request to operate at night is, I believe, still our #1 waiver request. You're going to submit a waiver application to the FAA that says, I want to operate at night. Here's all the hazards I identified and what risk they pose to me, and here's all the steps I'm going to take to mitigate that risk. The FAA looks at that waiver and says, we agree, you've taken all the steps we feel is necessary to operate outside of that rule, and they issue you a waiver. That waiver, I believe, is good for 2 years. I think that's the time frame I've been seeing on them. They might be a little bit longer now, but I thought that was pretty steady at 2 years. So you get a waiver for you to operate your UAS that you applied for on the waiver to operate at night. So that's the waiver. The waiver gives you the authorization, and I should probably not use that word because I don't want to confuse anyone what I'm about to say. The waiver gives you permission to operate outside of a rule, and it gives you that permission based on your risk analysis and how you're going to operate. So operating at night is our most requested waiver. Operating over people would be our second. I believe third is somewhere around operating beyond visual line of sight. Those are all waivers. Authorizations are for flying in airspace. So you're looking at Flying Cloud Class Delta or Crystal Airport Class D airspace. They got an air traffic control tower there. It's a Class T. Or Minneapolis Class B Bravo airspace. You are requesting authorization. You're not requesting to operate outside of the rule, because the rule just simply says you cannot operate in unless you have authorization from air traffic. So the authorization piece is what you're going to request to say, I need to fly at this location, this high, in this radius to do my job. And you submit that information online, and if the application's approved, you come back and says, yes, you're authorized to fly here, up to here, out to here for the next 6 months. You have that window in there. So that's our current authorization process. There are some things that are changing with that, some things much for the better that are coming, but that's the way the current authorization process works out. So you have authorizations, which means I want to comply with the rule because I need authorization to fly around Flying Cloud and Eden Prairie. And then you have waivers that say, I want permission not to comply with the rule based on my risk analysis of what I can do and the steps I'm going to take to mitigate any hazards in there. So those are the two different things. There's no cost to apply for a waiver. There's no cost to apply for an authorization. There's a lot of angst out there in the U.S. community with both topics right now because of the time it's taking. The reason it's taking so long is because we don't have the manpower set up to support all that yet, and the amount of requests that we're getting in is tremendous, which means that we're probably looking at changing the rule to meet the amount of requests coming in because we can't handle it. And on the air traffic side, we're implementing new software, new programs. One's called Lance that's coming online either now or already has. That's going to automate that air traffic authorization process. So instead of submitting online, waiting 90 days, which doesn't work for anybody in the UAS community, it's going to be you can pick up your phone, punch in your location, your altitude, your radius, hit submit. It pings a server, comes back, says you're good to go, or says no, you can't, or says please contact tower. It's going to go that fast. So we're getting rid of that 90. That's coming. It's what we always envisioned it to be, but that's on the authorization side. The waiver side will always be we request you submit 90 days in advance because we have to do a lot of research on your particular requests and how you're doing your risk analysis. So the waiver, I don't see that changing very much, other than maybe we change the rule that allows operating over people based on certain circumstances. I'm not sure. But the waiver requests will pretty much stay the same. Yes, sir.
Are they issuing the waiver for operating over people yet?
I should have known that question was coming. Yes and no. CNN had one, but they got it because they were part of the Pathfinder group, part of our initial research and development with how that was going to work. I have not seen one issued beyond that. And I know that the requests are just piling up for operating over people. It's not to say that we may not have issued one because they wouldn't tell me if they did necessarily. But I know that people are requesting it. Yeah, I think it would have been all over social media if they find out. I think that pipeline is starting to open up. We had all the intention of modifying the rule. In fact, I mean, this isn't secret. Administrator Huerta announced, well, back, I think almost after the rule was written, back in 2016, that we were looking at modifying operating over people. It takes a lot of money and resources to get a rule approved, even just a change of rule approved. And when we had the White House administrative change, as with any administrative change in the White House, everything just kind of gets put on hold until we figure out how the administration wants things done. And unfortunately, operating over people got caught in that. And so my understanding is that rule is almost ready to be put to the public for comment. But why they're waiting or what they need to see, I mean, quite frankly, I just found out yesterday that I'm still going to be working after October 1st. So I think certain things, you know, because of the budget stuff, I think certain things took priority over operating over people. But my understanding is that they are now looking at those waivers. I just don't know if we've issued any for operating over people. But I do know that we wanted to change the rule to allow for it based on a set of circumstances that the brain folks out there in DC came up with. Yes?
So directly related to that, I was also curious about what if I was a little confused about that, because if you're doing something creative and you have the consent of the people you're filming, and you're over them, is that also included in that restriction?
So if you get consent from the people you're filming, from the actors or the talent or what have you, does that allow you to operate over people? And the answer is no. It might ease your liability if that UAS were to crash into them, for example. And that's what we're really talking about. We're just talking about mitigating the risk of the UAS hitting them. The rule doesn't allow for that. So the rule just specifically states they have to be directly involved with the operation of the UAS. And so that even if you got everyone to sign waivers, I've had people even say, well, we're gonna put signs up at our outdoor venue that says, be aware, we are using drones to film this, and there may be a drone overhead. By entering the premises, you agree to be underneath a operating UAS or something like that. Again, that might work for liability if there's a lawsuit. I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but in terms of the FAA, that doesn't give you relief from the rule. If you want to operate over people not directly involved with the operation of the UAS, you need to apply for a waiver, unless we change the rule coming up here, but that's how it stands today.
So related to that again, so what if occasionally I'll be at an outdoor football game or an event, and I will see someone flying something over, and if they're as a hobbyist, do they slide under some sort of rule, or are they also in violation? No.
So here's the deal with the hobbyists. The question is, do the hobbyists get to fly over people? I can't as a Part 107 guy. I've been trained, I've been tested, I've registered, I'm a safe guy, yet I have to get a waiver and a hobbyist can just go do it. The reality is hobbyists are bound by a set of rules. And while it may appear to be, forgive me if the number is wrong, 4 or 5, I don't remember which one it is, not very many rules, one of them requires them to operate in accordance with a community-based set of safety standards. The easiest answer to that is the Academy of Model Aeronautics, the AMA. That's it's kind of like the big national model aircraft association. They have a safety code. You don't have to be a member of the AMA to see it. It's right on their website. It's a PDF. You can pull it up. They require you stay at least 25 feet away from people. So if somebody's flying as a hobbyist and they're saying, I don't have to follow Part 107, I can fly over people, and they go do that, and let's say something happens where they lose control of it and crashes, and I show up and start doing an investigation. One of the questions I'm going to ask is, what community-based safety guidelines were you operating under? I can almost promise you I'm going to get a deer in the headlight look. Like, what are you talking about? I'm a hobbyist. Because most people don't understand that there are rules for hobbyists that Congress made, not the FAA, Congress made them. And so that they are required to follow those rules. And so for the most part, hobbyists flying over people, I don't see how it works with safety guidelines. They would have to show me what nationally recognized community-based safety guidelines they're following that says, hey, that's cool, go ahead and fly over everyone. I haven't seen one yet. So when you're at that football game and somebody's flying over, chances are they're not complying with all the rules for hobby operation. And you remember back to what I said earlier, if you're not complying with all the rules for hobby, we consider you operating under Part 107. Even if you're not just following one of the things, you're operating under Part 107. So if you're operating under Part 107, you got to have the UAS registered, you got to have a remote pilot certificate. There's a whole set of regulations they could be in violation of by doing that. So certainly hobbyists are held to rules, not necessarily as many, but they're definitely there, and they don't give some of the permissions that you guys have. They obviously can't make money or sell their product to what you guys can do. I didn't want to skip this side of the room, but
I was just going to add, okay, so you're an AMA member, and your power diving points at a tower over here, what's that, the Copper Towers, and you also have advertising spots being sponsored. How's that?
so just so I know the question, like you're a hobbyist, all right, let's say you're a member of the AMA and you're sponsored by somebody to go fly your UAS?
It says YouTube videos, how you're being sponsored by it.
It's getting pretty muddy to try to still say you're a hobbyist if you're being sponsored by a company to operate.
Same as being, if you take YouTube videos and monetize.
Yeah, that question of taking a YouTube video and earning money via likes or subscriptions or whatever pay model that you set up is a topic of debate right now, not amongst FAA, but the attorneys. It's very difficult for us as an investigating inspector to comb YouTube. I quite frankly don't have the time, but even if I did, to comb YouTube to look for UAS videos and say, aha, I got you. In the legal world, in a court environment, a single YouTube video is not going to be worth anything. There is so much more that we need as evidence to prove beyond. Think of it this way, a YouTube video could be used as additional evidence to our main thrust of our investigation, but it can't be the primary source. We can't just say, aha, I caught you on YouTube, you're good to go. Now, making money off YouTube videos, here's where we get maybe into the semantics or intent, and this gets more to the attorneys than it does lowly inspectors like me. I would ask, when you're filming these videos, is your intent to get subscriptions and likes on YouTube because that pays you money? And if the answer was, yeah, I want to get as many people subscribed to my channel as I can, I want people to like the video as many times as I can because I get a little bit of money from it, I would say, sounds to me like you're operating under civil or commercial rules. If they said, no, I put these things up there because I like them, they're cool, I don't care how many people subscribe, my intent is not to make any money on this at all, this is just for my fun, I can't help it if people like and subscribe, and then YouTube writes me a check for $4. I would have a hard time, in my opinion, as an inspector, saying that you're operating commercially. It gets back to the intent, and anytime you get to the intent, I leave it to the attorneys. So yeah, the YouTube video is definitely a topic that we're discussing, or any social media site that pays you via clicks or advertising banners, things like that. You really get into this gray area, and that's not where I generally like to live, so I leave that up to the attorneys. It's a great question, though. Yes, sir.
In the good old days of the 333, you could apply for the close-set motion picture work. Is there a reason that the 107 can't adopt that?
So back in the 333 exemption days, you could do these, we used to call it the Hollywood exemption, but the motion picture media television, where you could film on a closed set, film over people and things like that. Will 107 allow for that? Right now it doesn't, obviously. I'm not sure if it would, with the way that they were looking at revising operating over people, because I never saw the proposed rule. But an important thing, and I'm glad you brought this up, the exemptions process is still alive. The exemption 333s are still there. If you have one, it's still valid. If you need one, you can still apply. So if you want to do closed set motion picture filming with a UAS, you can still apply for the exemption, and by all accounts, you would get it just as you would have originally before 107 came out online. Does that kind of answer your question? I mean, it's maybe not the greatest answer, but if you have an exemption now, you can still use it. Just remember, if you're operating under the exemption, that's exactly what you're operating under. You don't.
333 or 107.
Correct. You make that decision before you go airborne.
So in my rare case, I applied for a 333 in 2015 and still have not heard back.
Okay.
Who do I need to follow up?
You applied almost 2 years ago for a 333. Okay.
We have a 107 operating on our 107. So
Yeah.
Is there a way to check in and see where that process goes? Because depending on who you talk to, 333 is dead. No, 333 is
No, 333 is absolutely not dead. What we tried to do with Part 107 was eliminate the need for as many 333 exemptions as we possibly could. And it did a pretty good job of that. I want to say the number was like 95%. Like 95% of the 333 exemptions that were issued would no longer be needed because Part 107 and its allowances. And Part 107, for most people, 95% of people, was far more liberating than the 333 exemptions, where even under those conditions and limitations on those 333 exemptions, they were like, I got to be a private pilot or a recreational pilot. People are going out and earning manned aircraft pilot certificates just so they could get a 333 exemption. The remaining 5%, the exemption is still there. You can still apply for the exemption. It's a little bit disheartening to hear that you've had one sitting out there for 1.5 years or 2 years, and I don't have a good answer for you on that, because at our district level, we never even see them. We don't see them until they're approved. So I could direct you to our faa.gov/UAS website and click on the Help Me email, but you probably know how well that works out for you right now.
Can you direct me to a phone number?
Yeah, if I had a phone number, I'd give it to you, and I could almost guarantee you probably wouldn't get a return phone call because they're swamped. So I don't have a good answer for you other than I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. I don't have any input in that process.
So I have both 107 and 333. It's my understanding that yes, both are still viable to use, but I was not under the understanding that you could still apply for additional exemptions within 333. Or maybe or waivers, whatever the correct term would be. So, for instance, you know, for me to apply for motion picture, it's still possible to do that under my 333.
Is it still possible to apply for motion picture? Yes, under 333, yes, because that is something that 107 does not allow. Now,
do you know if they have granted any requests
to like to renew?
For 333, yeah, for anything, have they granted anything related to a 333 since the 107?
That I don't know if they've granted anything 333. Well, I will say this: it wouldn't surprise me if we hadn't, because we have sunk, other than your story right here, we have sunk every bit of human resource we have into the waiver process right now, because the majority of the UAS community right now is upset because the authorization process takes too long and they've been waiting forever for a waiver. So we funneled our resources into that. So anytime you take off here and put here, things here get stale.
It would be interesting to take a look at the site and see if they have actually authorized.
Yeah, well, if it's a 333, interestingly enough, you guys are all probably very good at research. If it's a 333, you can go to our website. It'll be all published on there. And if you haven't seen any published for a long, long time, you probably have the ugly answer on that. But I will stand up here and tell you that the 333 exemptions are not dead. You can still apply for them. But if it's something that is covered under Part 107, and they might even look at it as, well, you can get a waiver for that under Part 107, you probably won't get a 333 for it. For example, if your 333 was all because you wanted to operate at night, they probably won't give you another 333. They'll just say, apply for a waiver under Part 107. But the motion picture thing is a little bit unique in the fact that you're closed set, you operate over people. But I don't want to state this as fact, but it's possible they may look at that and say, well, just operate under Part 107 and apply for a waiver to operate over people. And they'll say it with a straight face.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I know. Other questions? I don't want to miss anybody. Yes, sir?
Any questions or any suggestions on how to approach it when you see an entity that thinks they can prevent you from flying over their property, say a university, perhaps?
Sure.
Specifically says drones are banned over our property.
Okay, so how do we approach an individual we know is wrong, let's say, in how they're enforcing their own ordinance or something like that? I have another presentation I do about aeronautical decision making and risk management for UAS, and one of the examples I give, you're flying over a city park, and there's no ordinances or something like that, but let's say the law enforcement officer comes up and he's confused, he says, hey, we don't allow drones over our city at all. Get the thing on the ground now. My response is land. Comply with the police officer. Listen to what he has to say. And then go into your education and outreach mode like, hey, we can do this. And you may not be able to finish filming that day. I don't recommend confrontation is the way to handle this. So even if it's not a police officer, if it's a university official, they say, hey, you can't fly drones over our campus. We have a university law that says you cannot fly over our campus. Land, talk, try to educate, work with them, accept the fact that today I might not be able to finish filming, but we're going to get this wrapped up. I'd like to meet, do your best to do that, because going the confrontational route never works out well for anybody, let alone your fellow remote pilots. So yes, you may be right, and you are right, let's say, for an example. But do your best to be a good citizen, fly neighborly. We have, where we used to have, I think we have signs out at various airports, flying cloud, something like that. They'll ask people, like, as you're getting near the runway, fly neighborly, or beware of noise, or be aware of your neighbors, and be quiet, because yeah, you have every right to go full power off the end of a runway in a manned aircraft and just blast your loud engine over everybody's houses without reducing power at all the way through up the climb, making all sorts of noise and rattling windows. There's nothing in the rule that prohibits that. But is that the right thing to do? Probably not, because you're going to want the support of the community. You want people to accept you and your operations into whatever area you're trying to fly in. And if we do it in the most neighborly way possible, you'll probably get that. It may not be today, but you'll probably get it. Versus the other thing, which is, you know, forget you, I'm flying anyway, you don't have any right, you go ahead and try to arrest me, I'll see you in court. That may complicate matters. So the best thing to do is, if you're confronted and somebody's trying to tell you that they have an ordinance or a rule that you know is trying to preempt federal law, to land, to try to educate, to meet with the officials, to get them on board, because it will save you a lot of heartache, and it may open a lot more doors for you and your fellow remote pilots moving forward. Yes, sir? Oh, yes. St. Bonifacius in the ordinance, right? I actually talked, I was going to try to get out to one of their city council meetings, as a matter of fact, and try to educate them, and I wasn't able to do that. But I know that they're not the only one, but there are, Isanti is another one in Minnesota that I believe has some drone ordinances as part of their latest revision to city planning. You try to educate, do the best you can. In the end, you're probably right and you have the authority to fly, but do whatever you can, whether it's university or city, to try to educate them. And if you want, put them in contact with me. You know, I'll be more than happy to talk to them on the phone. I'll even try to get out there if I can, but a lot of times these city ordinances are like 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. on a Tuesday night and they're 100 miles away. It's tough for me to get to logistically, but I'd be more than happy to talk to the folks on the phone if you direct them my way, because a lot of times they just don't know. And so a simple conversation educates them, and they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that, we'll go back and redraw it. And sometimes they do know and they don't care, and then they're not going to listen to you because who are you, but maybe they'll listen to Kevin Morris because he's an FAA guy. And once they figure out the difference between FAA and FFA, then usually we can have a decent conversation. But there's education, yeah, it's a work in progress, but certainly you can, please try to educate them. And if they just flat out refuse, please try to put them in contact with me or send them information. That's the best tool to start off with. I know, and I don't have all the details, but there's a recent, and you probably know this too, probably all of you guys, there's a recent court case where the city lost, right? The city had an ordinance, a remote pilot sued saying you can't do this, and took it to court and the city lost. Was it Massachusetts? Was that the state it was in? It wasn't here in Minnesota. Maine, maybe? Okay, but it's happening, and once word gets out of stuff like that, because nobody likes to lose in court, that will also hopefully drive cities to revisit their ordinances if they're trying to preempt.
Is there any, I don't know if I've searched specifically for this, any information that the FAA provides, either online or elsewhere, that I can direct people to say, go to this link right here, and it shows you right here that the FAA controls the airspace. Do you know of anything that simple? Or
I don't know that we have anything on a website that simply states, here's cities, here's the deal.
Yeah.
Does Know Before You Fly? There's a knowbeforeyouFly.org website. Did they have anything on there that might be useful? It's hard to say. I don't recall anything specific on our website that you could direct a city individual to say, hey, see, look at right on the FAA website, this. I mean, it's on there, but it's not going to be in a city council member friendly format, where they're going to understand it. Yeah. Oh, Rick, sorry.
Kevin, you mentioned this before. Even though the cities don't control the airspace, they do have other ordinances that they can enforce. They can enforce privacy, they can enforce trespass, they can enforce nuisance. And so those are not about your ability to fly the aircraft, but how you're operating the aircraft affects the people on the ground. And so, you know, it's a very muddy situation. And as Kevin said, the right thing to do is comply with an official that comes up and asks you to stop flying, and then go into the research. But I think you're going to find that people do not want drones flown over the heads of the people that are in there, that they're charged to protect. So if you're flying in a city park, and there's people enjoying the city park, and they're annoyed by you flying your UAS, you can expect that law enforcement will come out and ask you not to fly that UAS, and that seems to be a reasonable request.
Yep, I agree with all that. Just understand that in the heat of the moment when you're flying, if you're asked to stop, please stop and start with the education process on that, but realize, as I said and as Rick reiterated, they can enact ordinances, privacy, trespassing, things of that nature, property rights, that would prevent you from flying, launching, recovering, or your UAS. So just because the FAA says you can fly in the air, if the city says nobody launches or recovers a UAS from city park property, you're limited right there in what you can and cannot do. You may be able to step elsewhere, maybe get outside the city limits and fly it, but remember there's also visual line of sight. And operating under hobby rules, you can't go beyond visual line of sight either. If you're using first-person view, that's Part 107. First-person view is not considered hobbyist. That's another hotly debated topic I didn't really want to get into, but I sort of mentioned it. But anybody flying first-person view is considered to be operating under Part 107. But yeah, certainly know your local. And I know, so don't ask me a first-person view question. Right, but for first-person view? So if you look at the congressional law requires that it be within visual line of sight for a hobbyist. True. So your point is that just because the AMA says, hey, this is okay with us, it may not be okay with the congressional laws relating to hobby and recreational use. Yeah, very good point. And that just, when you're taking an aircraft, remember that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about toys. When you're taking an aircraft up into the National Airspace System, you need to know what you're doing. And that includes understanding what AMA says versus what Congress mandated versus what the FAA has required. So you need to understand all of that. You can't claim I didn't know. It doesn't work well with us FAA inspectors when we show up when something has happened. All right, we'll do a last question here.
Oh, that's not a good last.
Oh. Well, I'll stick around a little bit offline if you guys want to talk too, if you don't want to have it recorded. But anybody else want to shoot one more question up? And I don't want to take up too much time. I had an hour and we're just a little bit over that now. Okay, please continue to do your research, continue to fly the right way, please continue to educate. We're kind of all in this together. It's so new still. We've got over 100 years of manned aircraft flying in this country. We have really only about 5 to 10 years of civil or advanced UAS flying in this country. So this is all very, very new. And the more you can do to educate, the more you can be a good neighbor, the more you can be a friendly pilot, the more you help out everyone, not just locally, but nationwide as well. Yes?
I do have one last question. It could be a good way to finish it. Is like, with what you've seen, do you have any predictions on the viability as an industry, and just where does your gut feeling see this all going?
So, like, where do I see UAS going in the future in terms of an industry? This is my personal opinion now. This is not an FAA statement. My personal opinion is that this is the future of aviation. You're looking at, I believe it's Dubai, starting to operate air taxis. They had it sitting out there at Oshkosh, and I can't remember the name of the company, but it was a kind of a cockpit bubble with a seat in it, and it was a quadcopter. I don't know how to describe it. With
1 and 2 seaters.
1 and 2 seaters, right? No pilots on board. It was a drone. But you sat in it and it would fly you, theoretically. I never saw it move. But, and I know I've been reading in the paper that I think Dubai is testing this air taxi thing where it just lands at your house, you get in, takes you and flies away, no pilot on board and drops you off. I will never get in one of those things. But where do I see this going? Unlimited. Unlimited. I really believe this is the future. Now I should probably do this disclaimer. I don't own a UAS. I don't fly a UAS, but that's not where my specialty lies. My specialty lies in risk management and helping pilots and understanding the rules and getting the education out there. But this stuff is just going crazy. You look at the advancements in UAS in just the last 5 years, based on what you could buy. Let's say what you could buy 10 years ago. DJI, have they been operating for at least 10 years or close to that? I'm asking you because I see a sticker on your laptop, but what you could buy from DJI's first product to what you can buy now, right? And that's 10 years. I mean,
every 1 or 2 years. It used to be every 3 months that something.
You're right. Almost every 3 months something come out. To me, it follows kind of like the computer thing. I forget the name of the law that says computers will, Moore's law, right? It's sort of like UAS is doing the same thing. It's like every 5-10 years, it's like a completely revolutionized, new capable piece of equipment. And if they figure out battery technology, which is what everybody honestly is waiting for, whether it's cell phone, car, or UAS, but if they figure out a way to redo batteries where you can get the same amount of weight giving you 5 times the life, it will revolutionize many things, but certainly UAS. Because what is your average flight time now in a UAS? 15, 20 minutes? Somewhere in there, right, before you got to really start thinking about putting it down. Imagine if you could go 2-3 hours on a single battery charge.
That's what you're doing. If you can't get your shot in 15 minutes, you better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, but think of like I don't know. So to me, the industry is just skyrocketing, and the challenge is going to be for organizations like MnDOT Aeronautics and the FAA to hang on by our fingertips to keep up with the changes and the advancements, because we're not doing it very well right now. The capabilities of UAS right now far exceed what we just put on paper and law in 2016. It's like as soon as that law hit, we had to start working on changing it again, and we're going to be playing catch up because this industry is growing so quickly that it's going to be a challenge for us to keep up, regulatory speaking, but also education, and then compliance and enforcement. We don't have dedicated enforcement people for drones at every field office, or almost any field office to my knowledge. We have people like me that are kind of assigned to it, but we don't go running around looking for drones. I mean, I drove down 494 the other day and there was a UAS hovering right above the highway. I'm not swerving across 3 lanes of traffic to try to hit an exit ramp to go track down the guy. I don't know where he's flying it from. I don't know anything, but are we going to, at the FAA level, going to have dedicated drone enforcement? I imagine someday, yeah, we will. We'll have to have that. Because if we've got 2 to 3 times as many UAS aircraft in the National Airspace System flying around as manned aircraft, where's the risk? Maybe the risk is shifting a little bit. We have to dedicate resources. Or technology, or air traffic control procedures. Are we going to be limited to 400 feet all the time? What if you can get ADS-B surveillance in and out on a UAS? Can you go up to 18,000 feet now and do your work? I don't know. That's something we're going to have to change. So it's really exciting, and it's growing like crazy. I don't see it stopping anytime soon, and it's kind of exciting, honestly, to see the advancement and the development. It's really kind of neat.
One super quick question. Can you comment on your, I've heard that the FAA and AirMap have partnered in some regards. This air traffic management is basically what the software is down to in the future. Are you familiar with how things are progressing?
I'm familiar of AirMap, and that there is some sort of effort that's happened or working on to coordinate effort between the FAA and AirMap. I don't know specifics on what they're doing. I know that like the grid maps for ATC authorization, we're starting to publish those on that ArcGIS website, and that the LANS authorization system is going to ping off of that. So I know that we're catching up, and AirMap probably figures into that somewhere, but that's being handled in the higher grounds and the hallowed halls of DC versus the weeds of the field office. Oh, now you have a last question.
I'm only going to add a correction
Okay.
to my statement before, and then it's Singer versus the City
Oh, it was in Massachusetts. Okay, and then the
Just so it doesn't correct it.
yeah, oh yeah, it was a Massachusetts court. So the genesis of that was that the city lost its authority to enact those ordinances, which were determined to be preempting federal law, right? Okay, good deal. All right, guys, thanks for your attention and time. I appreciate it. We'll see you around. Email me, call me with any questions. I'll be around. All right, thank you. Yep.